We have made it to the trade deadline here in year number 2 of the Golden State Warriors franchise here on NBA 2K25. Today, we're going to look to add to this roster and hopefully better position ourselves for a playoff run this year, something that we were ultimately unsuccessful in doing so last year, but also try to build for the future as well and look at the long-term outlook of our team. We're 33-17 and 5th in the Western Conference. Also, in the last episode, we went through our very first prospect profiles of the year, going over some of the top prospects in this year's draft. And in case you missed that episode, I'll leave a card at the top right of your screen for you to go ahead and check out. So to look at the current situation where we're at, we've had a good month of January, but we lost to the Jazz twice. And that's embarrassing because they are maybe the worst team in NBA history. Third time's the charm. We beat them in their place by 14 without Jimmy Butler. That's because he suffered a foot fracture most recently against the Lakers. We've got 4 guys currently injured, and our depth is really being tested, and hopefully we can add to that depth here at the deadline. We're currently in 5th, but as you can see, it's really close between 2 and 6. We're only 2.5 games out of 2nd, so there's a lot of room for us to possibly climb. But you also have to take into account that a lot of these other teams are probably going to make additions as well. The East, of course, is nowhere near as good as the West. The Raptors, who are currently the number 1 seed, would only be in the play-in tournament of our conference. And if we were in the East, we would somewhat convincingly be the number 1 seed, which is sort of crazy to think about. But it just goes to show how good and how competitive things are in the West. With Butler and Kuminga and Jackson Davis and Bona all injured, we've certainly relied on everybody else to step up. But I do want to give credit to Miles Turner. He's had a rough season shooting the ball, but he's had his best stretch of action as a Warrior. And as we look at this roster going into the deadline, I think it's pretty clear we're probably not going to be star hunting, being that we're not financially in a position to do so. And we also don't really have the assets. So that's why we didn't really talk about the idea of adding a star player, because we did that last year with Jimmy Butler. And it's also worth noting that the star market is pretty dry as of now. Obviously, Butler's been moved. Trae Young was moved in the offseason. But some of the names I would look out for include Lauri Markkanen. This would certainly be selling low, but he's had a rough year, and maybe the Jazz figure, let's just get something for him before his value completely depletes. The Clippers have been disappointing. Kawhi Leonard is still playing really well, though. Maybe they look to move on from him and rebuild. The Sixers have also been disappointing. I think they're going to want to stick with their big 3, though. And then LeBron is the wild card because he is planning on retiring at the end of the season. That certainly hurts his value, but his play has not regressed, although I don't think the Lakers are in position to compete for a title. And then New Orleans, they're currently in 7th. They've been pretty good this year. I wouldn't rule out the idea of them blowing it up, but I think it's a little bit too early for the Pelicans to do that quite yet. So after losing this game last episode against Denver, we've got them on the schedule again. We're going to simulate that game before we make our decisions in terms of trades, and we get the win, performing a lot better. We allowed 152 last time. Here, we only allow 103. Antoine Salice leads the team in scoring again. Miles Turner with a double-double. He played well once more. And Nikola Jokic was held in check for the most part, despite a big game from Jamal Murray. 33-17, 5th place, going into the deadline. And the question is, what moves are we going to make? This team certainly lacks young assets to move off of. Assuming a guy like Antoine Salice is off the table, there aren't really many guys here who I imagine teams are going to be interested in. But the one name who I would watch out for is Brandon Podziemski. He has not had a great season this year. Now, he has had a really strong month of January. His role has increased, and he's delivered, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. But what I've noticed in some of the trades that we've been offered for him throughout the year is that maybe I'm just lower on him because we've been given some really good deals. Jared McCain is averaging 15 a game on great efficiency. Andrew Nembhard's averaging almost 20 a game on really good efficiency. We got both of these offers earlier in the season, and I don't think it would make sense for these teams, but I figured, what are some of the other offers out there? And there's a lot of interest for him across the rest of the NBA. We can get solid players and draft picks out of him, including the likes of Peyton Watson in Denver with the Nuggets. We could get a guy like Jalen Duren from Detroit. Nicolas Papadakis, drafted late in the first round by the Raptors. We can get him and a future first. This pick, very valuable from the Houston Rockets. And then the very best trade in here is Cason Wallace, who I think is very clearly better than Podziemski on both ends of the floor. We can get him and a future first rounder from Oklahoma City. Now, none of those deals are realistic because we'd be ripping off the other teams, but it does make me think that Podziemski has some value around the league, maybe more value than he has for us. A couple episodes ago, I posed the question, what does he really do? He's supposed to be a good three-point shooter, but he struggled to be efficient there. He's not a great defender. He's not a great playmaker. He's not a great athlete. He's not a great finisher. I mean, he rebounds well, and he has a good feel for the game at being just 22 years old. But I don't think he's some spectacular young piece who we have to be attached to. And if other teams value him more than us, it might make sense to try to maximize that. So going through some of the trades, I like this one from Boston. Terrence Mann and a first-round pick next year. Mann's had a good season, but there are some guys on this roster I would prefer, specifically Jordan Walsh. Only 21 years old. He can defend 4, maybe all 5 positions, and he's not a complete liability on offense. His true shooting percentage is around league average. I don't know why his estimated wins added is negative. Now, Boston's not going to do that, understandably so. Walsh is a more valuable piece than, say, Terrence Mann. But I'm going to try to make this work in any way I can. However, it seems like they're really committed to their current core, at least for the time being, and they feel good with what they have at the guard spot. So I'm going to go back into the trade finder, and I'm intrigued by this one with the Bulls. I like Ayo Dosunmu a lot. He's an efficient player, but has really struggled this season. And a change of scenery for both him and Podziemski could make sense. I think they're pretty equal in terms of caliber of player. Dosunmu's about to enter a pretty team-friendly 3-year deal, but he's also 4 years older. And naturally, Podziemski's value will be higher because of that. So I'd like to see if I can get a pick back from the Bulls. They don't own that Blazers pick. Some of the picks in this game are wrong. I'm going to make sure those are right before the draft, but that pick belongs to Portland. But I wouldn't mind the idea of getting their first-round pick next year. Now, if I made this unprotected, that would be pretty bad for the Bulls, especially if they do decide to tear it down and rebuild. But I'm totally fine with making it a lottery-protected pick. I just want to add another first-rounder in the arsenal, even if it is heavily protected. We do need to add a match in salary, and it works out that the Bulls only have 14 players on their roster. Haywood Highsmith is probably the easiest match. He's had a solid year from 3. He's had a very bad year from 2. But this trade is a pretty good framework of something. I don't think the Bulls are going to accept it, but it's worth a shot, and sure enough, they say no, as expected. So I figured I would add some of these second-round picks we currently own. Now, the wild card is that Jazz pick we have this year, because the Jazz are the worst team in the league. So that's probably going to be pick 31, which is almost like having another first-rounder. I want to hold on to that pick if I can, because I think that could be quite valuable. So I put the other 2 seconds in. They say no, but we get an interesting counter. Caleb Martin and the Jazz pick for Jalen Smith. We were offered a deal earlier in the year that involved Smith, and I said that he'd be a good fit for us. I would really like adding Jalen Smith to this roster, but I don't want to give up that Jazz pick. Being stingy about a second-rounder may sound pretty stupid, but I really want to hold on to that pick if I can. So maybe the idea would be adding more second-rounders down the line. We're going to trade Pele Larson to the Pistons for 2 future second-rounders. Larson just doesn't really have a role here, and the Pistons have a lot of future second-rounders in their arsenal, but I want to see if maybe we can send one of those picks to the Bulls instead before making this deal with Detroit. Ultimately, the Bulls would end up saying no. So then I'm going to try the other pick. I'm willing to not get either of these seconds, and the Bulls still say no. That's unfortunate. So as I look at the Bulls here, they are in 12th, and I can understand them not wanting to trade away that first-rounder next year, even if it is lottery protected, because they might need it to really help a potential future rebuild, being that this core isn't really going anywhere anytime soon. So the idea I have is looking at Oklahoma City and giving Chicago their first-round pick back in 2029. That's a number of off seasons away, but if the Bulls do plan to rebuild, that pick could become pretty valuable. Obviously, the Thunder have plenty of draft picks in their arsenal, and if they can get some help to potentially improve their championship outlook, it makes sense. Now, Podziemski's still going to the Bulls. Dosunmu would still be going to the Warriors. But the thought I have is that Hamidou Diallo and Dennis Schroeder would go to Oklahoma City, and Ousmane Dieng would go to the Bulls as kind of a reclamation project, and the Bulls say yes. Now, Oklahoma City says no, but I'm very encouraged that Chicago would agree. They clearly like the idea of adding Ousmane Dieng to the roster. So now we're going to try to trade some of these second rounders to Oklahoma City instead, and the Thunder ultimately still say no. So that brings us back to the idea of the trade with Detroit and Pele Larson. So now we're going to get the 2 second rounders here. The Pistons have a lot of second rounders in the future. They can afford to take a shot on a guy like Larson, who has multiple years left on his deal and has some potential upside. So let's now go back to the 3-team deal that I had set up with the Bulls and Thunder that Oklahoma City originally did not agree to. Wait a second. Now they want to do it. I didn't even add either of the second rounders from the Pele Larson trade. That was the exact same deal we originally set up. And just to prove it to you guys, the trade negotiation difficulty is still on 55, which is where I usually have it. So I guess we've got a deal. Brandon Podziemski is now on the Bulls. Ayo Dosunmu is now with us. And we add a first rounder from Chicago. We are giving up some other role players. Hamidou Diallo and Dennis Schroeder return to the Thunder. They wanted to add a couple more pieces to help their title push. Haywood Highsmith is now with the Bulls, along with Brandon Podziemski. And it is a little bit unfortunate because going into the series, I was really hoping that Podziemski would be a core piece and he'd stick around for a while. But I just don't think he's a great fit for the roster, and his progression has been a little bit underwhelming in my opinion. With Ayo Dosunmu, he'll play the same role as Podziemski, but I think he's going to end up being better. I think he's a better shooter from 3 and the mid-range. I think he's a little better defensively. I like what he offers as a playmaker. Now, his efficiency this year has been really bad. 51% true shooting percentage. But his true shooting mark is at 60% over each of the last 2 years. And I'm hoping we can rebuild that. But what I'm most excited about with this trade is this Bulls pick in 2027. We've got ourselves a nice toy that we can play with in the future as an asset via trade, or potentially a solid pick in either 2027 or 2028. And I think from there, we are not going to make any more deals. I did some searching in the trade finder, looking to add some more size. Leonard Miller was a guy I tried to get from Minnesota, but there wasn't really an easy way to make the salaries work. He's making too little of money. So I think we're going to stick with what we've got, and this is what the lineup is going to look like for now. As you'll notice, there are only 8 healthy players on the roster and 12 players total. We need to fill out this team because we cannot have 8 healthy players. That is the recipe for disaster. So we're going to sign 3 guys out of free agency. We'll start with Larry Nance. He's a veteran big, good teammate, brings the vibes, can space the floor a little bit, decent enough defender. He'll sign for a 1-year minimum. Sam Merrill can shoot the piss out of the ball. Doesn't provide much else, but he gives us another spacer off the bench. And then last but not least, our good friend, Killer Cam Reddish. Although he says no. Well, that's unfortunate. I was really looking forward to adding him. Instead, we're going to have to settle for David Duke Jr., not to be mistaken with the other David Duke, but we're going to add him as someone who can provide some energy. Doesn't really have any major weaknesses to his game. Kind of a slightly worse and certainly less athletic version of Hamidou Diallo. So now this is what the lineup looks like with Ayo Dosunmu sliding into the starting shooting guard position. He will regularly come off the bench once Jimmy Butler and Jonathan Kuminga are healthy, and he's going to play a pretty similar role to what we had for Brandon Podziemski, but I'm hoping he's going to do it a little bit more effectively than what we had with Podziemski. And we only have 4 players from the original team from Season 1 left on the roster. Curry, Kuminga, Buddy Hield, and Trace Jackson-Davis. That's it. Teams change very quickly in the NBA, and we are seeing that in full force with our Warriors team. Let's go through some deals around the rest of the league. The Utah Jazz are going to have a busy deadline, and that starts with moving on from Lauri Markkanen. He's had a really bad year. You'd hope with the lack of scoring the Jazz have that he'd be able to step it up, and he has not. He's going to the Miami Heat. Andrew Wiggins and Harrison Barnes are basically throw-ins in terms of salary. The bulk of this deal is Nikola Jovic, who's shooting 40% from 3, and a future first-rounder in 2030. Markkanen joins a talented Heat core with Tyler Hero, Jalen Suggs, and Bam Adebayo, while the Jazz get a little bit younger with Nikola Jovic, who instantly becomes by far their most efficient scorer. But the Jazz are not done. They are swapping Taylor Hendricks for Keegan Murray. Hendricks has not taken the step in development they had hoped for, Whereas with the Kings here and Keegan Murray, he's on the last year of his deal, and Sacramento is reluctant to give him a long-term extension. I think Keegan Murray fits with the Jazz roster better because, again, they need somebody who can be an efficient floor spacer. And with Taylor Hendricks, the Kings are getting a guy who they have an extra year with on the rookie contract. So now the Jazz are going to be moving on from both Keontae George and Lonzo Ball to try to free up some playing time for their other young guards, Isaiah Collier and Devin Harbor. George has not taken the efficiency leap that Utah was hoping for, and Lonzo Ball, that signing has just been a complete disaster. He is shooting 32% from the field. So George is going to the Nets for Naz Reid. They signed him to a big deal from Minnesota. He's been kind of disappointing so far. And then Lonzo's going to the Pistons for Tobias Harris. I think this trade helps all three teams formulate their rosters better. The Pistons can slide Ron Holland into the starting lineup with Asar Thompson. The Nets add a backcourt partner for Cam Thomas. And the Jazz have an entirely different team, which was needed considering the previous team, well, you could have confused them for construction workers with all the bricks they were laying. Next up, the Los Angeles Lakers will be getting an upgrade at point guard, sending Jalen Hood-Schifino and Gabe Vincent to the Wizards for Malcolm Brogdon. They want to compete regardless if LeBron is on the roster or not, so they'll be adding Brogdon from Washington. Let's now talk about the Rockets, who have been accumulating assets over the last few years to make a splash. They've gotten a lot of future first-round picks, and they have an abundance of young talent. They've been waiting for the time to cash out, and it's now. They'll be getting De'Aaron Fox from the Kings, who intentionally chose not to sign an extension when he was eligible, I would assume, to keep open the possibility of wanting to leave. Well, he's on the last year of his deal. The Kings really haven't improved as of recent, and he's ready to move on. The Rockets want to do their new star player well, so they're going to bring along his friend Malik Monk. The Kings will be getting Fred VanVleet, Dennis Gordon, Jabari Smith, and 3 number ones. Fred VanVleet's on the last year of his deal. He's not that exciting of a pickup, but Dennis Gordon is. The rookie from France appears to be in the running for their long-term point guard of the future. Jabari Smith is expiring, but there is some upside there. And then 3 first-rounders going to the Kings, so their roster looks entirely different, but they should still be good enough to compete for a play-in spot out west. Fred VanVleet is still a capable starter. Jabari Smith, Taylor Hendricks, and Dennis Gordon give this team some new youth. Not to mention the 3 first-rounders they add, making them potentially aggressive players in the future down the line. I don't think the Kings are going to start a full-on rebuild. I think it's just that they saw the writing on the wall with De'Aaron Fox likely not wanting to re-sign with them this upcoming offseason. As for Houston, they hold on to what I believe is their most valuable draft pick, a swap best first-rounder next year with the Brooklyn Nets. And they still have plenty of future first-rounders down the line, and they still have plenty of young players they can trade away as well. Assuming they re-sign Fox, him and Şengün are likely going to be the top 2 here, but they have Amen Thompson, who apparently has already been extended. I don't know how that's possible since he's only in his 3rd season. They've also done it with Cam Whitmore. Again, no clue how they did that. I'll try to edit that to make sure those don't go through. But regardless, I imagine they see Thompson and Whitmore as long-term pieces. But they do have other tradable assets, including Reed Shepherd, Grady Dick, maybe Tari Eason, although he's expiring. Anthony Simons is also expiring. I'd imagine they would probably let him walk in the offseason, especially with the addition of Malik Monk. But once Amen Thompson and Alperen Şengün are healthy, this team will be very competitive in the Western Conference playoff race. And last but not least, that brings us to LeBron James. And when he signed with the Lakers in 2018, I imagine he did it with the idea that he's going to retire here. However, I don't think he could have expected himself to be this good for this long. And now at 41 years old, at the end of his NBA career, he knows that he would still like to compete for one more title. And I feel like there's a very obvious landing spot who would be able to make the money work. LeBron James, over the last couple of years, has been heavily linked to the Boston Celtics. He was rumored and potentially wanting to buy an ownership stake in the team after their primary owner sold most of the stake of the Celtics. As I said, they'll be able to make the money work. And I think there's a clear player who would make sense for the Lakers. When they traded for Jaren Jackson in the offseason, I kind of figured that Kristaps Porzingis probably would not be here for the long haul. They ended up holding on to him, and the team has performed fairly well. But with him on the last year of his deal and him being unlikely to return this offseason, the Celtics figure that he can be the main asset in a LeBron trade, and the 2 teams would strike a deal. Now, LeBron has asked to be joined by the squad, Bronny James and Draymond Green will be joining him. Bronny, I think, is the more interesting one because under the assumption that LeBron James will buy a stake in the Celtics after he retires, he will remain in the same organization as his son and his wine buddy, Draymond Green. The Lakers are reportedly very excited about adding Porzingis. They feel like him and Anthony Davis can be a true twin tower duo, if you will. Drew Holiday is also in this deal. Now, unfortunately for Drew, he is beyond cooked. His efficiency this year has been a complete train wreck, and Boston's probably better off getting rid of him here. So for the Lakers to take on his contract, the Celtics will also be giving them Baylor Shireman and some future second rounders, and the deal is done. LeBron James will be finishing his NBA career in Boston with the Celtics. And I think this makes a lot of sense for both teams because LeBron is not going to be on the Lakers next year. Porzingis is not going to be on the Celtics next year. So a swap probably helps both teams out for the future. And this Celtics lineup will become scary. Keep in mind, Jason Tatum is currently injured. But when he comes back, him, Jaylen Brown, and LeBron James on the floor at the same time, that's frightening. I really want to see this team in action. And look who they have next on the schedule. How perfect. We get to play against the Boston Celtics in LeBron's debut at the TD Garden after a very exciting deadline. Don't worry about those two trades with the Rockets and the draft picks. I did those to make sure their picks were right because as I mentioned with the Bulls earlier, 2K got a lot of these draft picks wrong. Good job, 2K. So that brings us here to this game against the Celtics. And normally, this is where I would play the game against the Celtics. However, I will be saving it for the next episode instead. That's because I had some technical issues getting the game against the Celtics off my PlayStation. Something happened kind of similarly a couple months ago, and ironically, it was in the trade deadline for Season 1 of this series. So maybe Warriors franchise trade deadlines are just cursed or something. But yeah, that will ultimately be in the next episode where we take a look at LeBron's debut as a Celtic, and more excitingly, in my opinion, Aya DeSunmu's debut as a Warrior. Hope everybody enjoyed the episode. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.